Cyberpunk 2077 may have had a rocky release, but after a couple of years and some major updates, it plays like a dream. For the most part. I initially bought into Cyberpunk mainly due to the hype around the game, only to find that version 1.0 was far from a finished product. Hell, I even bought a physical copy in addition to the digital so that I would always have access to the game as it was released. However, due to the state of the game at the time, I decided to hold off on completing the game. Though with the release of Cyberpunk Edge Runners and a handful of updates later, I thought it was time I gave it a serious try. Not just once, but twice, with different builds and life paths and different genders for romance options and different endings. I did this to get a good perspective on how combat works for different builds and to see the outcomes of various dialogue choices throughout the game. My first character, I chose the Nomad life path, speccing primarily into body and reflexes for a tanky run and gun build. In doing so, I focused on using blades, shotguns, and LMGs, opting to use a Sandevistan processor over one with a focus on quick hacks. Because of the high investment in body, this V had a high health pool and regen passives, while reflexes made her deadly with a blade and allowed me to attack, aim, and block while using my mobility options. While I did use cybernetics extensively, the only notable choices would be the double jump and mantis blades. Double jump seemed obvious to me since it would add to my mobility and allow me to access hard to reach areas. Using the mantis blades allowed me to free up a weapon slot so I could try other weapons while still taking advantage of my stat and perk allocations. Once in Act 2, I made a beeline for the free Sandevistan to have it installed for the majority of my run, eventually working my way towards buying the Sandevistan from Fingers in Japantown. I beat the game at around level 35, having done a good amount of side quests and NCPD encounters prior to entering Act 3, as well as choosing to let Johnny storm Arasaka HQ with Rogue. As for my second character, I decided to go with a male street kid, speccing into intelligence and tech, putting the rest into reflexes and body. This time, I wanted an emphasis on quick hacking and crafting while coincidentally buffing tech weapons. I ran with my original processor for a time, eventually shooting for the Biodyne Mark IV, and then finally moving up to the Tectonic Rippler once I finally got my hands on some of the ultimate quick hacks. Since body was not a priority this run, my character was a bit more of a glass cannon, although that only lasted for a time as I could easily incapacitate most enemies without even entering combat, leaving a few left to clean up with the monowire or my tech rifle, of which both were pretty powerful in their own right. I beat the game at under level 30, though I did significantly less side jobs prior to moving to Act 3, and I chose to go with Pan Am's ending. With a general idea of my builds and life paths and all that stuff out of the way, I think we can finally talk about some of the combat encounters. Now, this is an FPS game, and so combat should be core, even with all of the open world RPG elements. While I found the combat enjoyable, I did find it repetitive once my character was chromed out to an extent. I found that a majority of the combat situations were kind of samey, and while I can partially blame that on my choice of build, the combat didn't really challenge me in any meaningful way as I progressed through the main story of the game. For example, most enemies are largely the same, differing really in appearance, and while there are significant challenges in higher levels, it is not due to a change in the combat loop, but rather having tankier, harder-hitting enemies rather than introducing something new. And yes, there are enemies with different enhancements, but they were usually dead or knocked down before they could use them effectively. That's not to say that I hate the reskins of gang members, as it fits the world we are exploring, but I do think that these enhanced enemies could have had more of an impact in the combat. However, there are examples of good combat encounters in the Cyber Psycho missions or the boss fights in general. Most Cyber Psycho missions introduce us to a chrome jockey off their rocker, and they each have different abilities and don't usually die in a hit or two, which presents a unique combat situation even though the majority of these fights were a 1v1. Perhaps one of my favorites was the Phantom of Night City Cyber Psycho mission. In this mission, we are introduced to an enemy that vanishes after the initial encounter, only to end up in an area filled with gang members. This encounter presented a situation in which I not only had to deal with a boss-type enemy, but I had an entire area of gang members to fight through as well. Encounters like this put an emphasis on target priority and positioning over simply entering into an encounter with your processor or best hack and eliminating a number of goons before they even know you are there. And while not an overly difficult encounter, it was still enough to keep me on my toes. Another mission that I quite enjoyed was infiltrating the Grand Imperial Mall for the Voodoo Boys. In this mission, Placide tasks you with infiltrating the GIM to see why the Animals, one of the various gangs in Night City, were guarding a van with Netrunner gear, only to find out that they were hired by Netwatch so they could try to take down Ogway, a version of the net that the Voodoo Boys had access to. Now, Placide talks as though you need to do this quietly, though it isn't an optional objective, so needless to say, this area is a playground for the player to test their build against over 30 Animals members in an area that has plenty of verticality and is relatively open. It is honestly one of the best designed levels in the game. This is also due to the fact that after you reach the van after dispatching the Animals, there is one final obstacle standing in your way before you confront the Netwatch agent, Sasquatch. There is so much to this encounter that it makes it stand out. First of all, she has the ability to tackle or knock you down consistently if you don't have the right perks to prevent it. If she knocks you down after detecting you, she will try to infect you with a virus from Netwatch that Placide has to fight off. Additionally, what looks to be an open area to fight in quickly turns into an obstacle course once the fight begins, with hidden dividers rising from the ground. The close quarter nature of this fight forces you to be on your toes with rarely a decent opportunity to pull off a quick hack, though it's possible. And all of this leads up to a decision. Let Netwatch keep the Voodoo Boys virus from killing you after a job well done, or take the agent out and be infected with a virus. Either way, it leads to confronting all past the Black Wall, and you still have the option to deal out some justice for Placide trying to kill you. All in all, this was one of my favorite parts of the game. With all of that being said, I did experience some hiccups with combat from time to time, most notably with the cybernetic implants. Sometimes the weapon reticle would be visible, but the weapon itself was not. Most prominently, the projectile launch system was the worst offender. No matter how many times I would use it, all I got was the reticle, and the firing delay varied from maybe just a couple of seconds, which is understandable, I guess, to upwards of 10 to 15 seconds, which in that time the enemy had moved out of the way by the time it had fired. This led to me abandoning the implant altogether, which was for the best since the Mantis blades or mono wire seemed to be pretty powerful with my builds. The vehicles in the game were a neat alternative to fast travel, though they were the most noticeable bugs in my playthroughs. Sometimes I would be sent flying into the air for no reason, other times I would fall through the map, and any other oddity was due to other vehicles in traffic not loading in and causing me to crash. Additionally, driving to an objective over, say, 200 meters away, I would still have to wait for the area to load completely. This was true for doors, NPCs in the area, and of course, any enemies I might be tasked with fighting. At first, I thought this was because I drove too fast to reach my destination, so I tried fast travel for a time. This didn't seem to help, as most of what I mentioned before still needed to load in despite me waiting through a load screen. Now, one feature I wish this game had was to let the player customize vehicles, weapons, and clothing a bit more. I don't know. Something bothers me about paying a bunch of eddies to get a specific color of car, only to see that same car with a different paint job on the street. Same goes for weapons, as I would find a weapon with a cool color design on it, but the ones I craft are just the default. I mean, I'm playing as one of the best mercs in the city, but I can only make or buy the most generic cars and weapons. It's kind of basic. That being said, the open world aesthetic was phenomenal, and the world felt lived in. If I had any complaint about this, it was the fact that the game locks you out of most areas for the first hour. This is done to push you towards completing Act 1, which would be fine, but to me this part of the game dragged the most. While I don't mind the narrative locking you down in order to push you towards progressing, it felt like I was sitting through a movie. I don't know. I feel like if you wanted me to focus on the main story in the beginning, you could have just had me do so with less freedom, so I could take that curiosity into Act 2 and really check out the landscape. Maybe it's not at all a problem, or maybe it would be less of one if more of the dialogue could be skippable in those scenes. It's odd because in most scenarios, whether it's an important mission or not, I can skip through the dialogue, but then there are these instances in which I have to sit through it, and for me, this is what made the first act drag. When I load in a game, I want to play said game, even if that means having to sit through some tutorial stuff. I still get to test things out, but to sit through what seems like endless dialogue? Listen, I get it. You need to set up the narrative, show the player where they came from, who they meet up with, and how we get from point A to point B, but by my second playthrough, it just felt tedious. Now, there are playable parts where you get to experiment with game mechanics and explore a bit, but I couldn't help but feel rushed to complete the heist. Overall, this caused some weird pacing issues. On one hand, I feel rushed to complete the first act with no real stakes at play, and on the other, Act 2 is when you get control to explore and fool around in Night City despite the fact that you are now in a life or death situation with little time to waste. I'm not sure if there is a solution to this, but Act 2 should be ramping up to a conclusion and as such should push the player towards reaching the third act. The stakes are higher in Act 2 and it feels off to have this be the point in the game in which you get full control to explore the open world. But hey, I could be wrong. As far as the narrative is concerned, it was fantastic. From meeting Jackie and watching Dex get his brains blown out, to meeting Johnny and Rogue in addition to all of the other memorable characters you can't help but feel like you care for, even if most of them don't get a happy ending. Even some of the side quests have characters that you really feel for, whether you are crucifying a man for some corpos wanting to sell a BD, or solving the mystery of Barry's best friend. This made it feel like it was less of a quest and more of an opportunity to meet people in this world, which eventually led to picking an ending. Personally, my favorite ending was Pan Am's. It had everything I wanted out of a world that feels so bleak. This was the ending I chose for my Street Kid Netrunner, and it just felt so right. The Street Kid tried leaving Night City on his own only to be led back. So leaving with the Nomads felt much more impactful as he now has people that will go through anything to help and support him. For my Nomad, I went with Rogue's ending for no reason but to give Johnny a chance at redemption, but also owning the afterlife sounded like a pretty sweet gig too. For a large part of our early moments with Johnny, he just seemed like a dickhead hell-bent on trying to get our body. But as we get to know each other, we become closer, and we start to realize that he was kind of robbed, and so we start to feel for the guy. Hell, he even wants to help you keep your body by the time we meet Alt and learn more of his backstory. You can't help but feel emotional by the end of the game, especially when taking your body back. He doesn't even fight for it. Now, I'm not big on the narrative in most games, but when done right, I return for more than just the gameplay, and that was something that CDPR did extremely well. The only real issue I had with the narrative was that of V's fate. It's told to us by Alt that the biochip, albeit damaged, had been converting V's DNA to Johnny's, and that is why we will eventually die. But Alt couldn't write a program to reconvert the DNA back to V's? Like, wouldn't it be a program responsible for that in the first place? And since she is making us an engram, couldn't she do the same for us? I don't know. I might be misinterpreting this, but who knows? I guess it's true that no one gets a happy ending in Night City, unless of course you let Johnny take the body. The future is looking good for Cyberpunk, at least for the majority of players. Patch 1.7 looks to bring even more features to the game, which is great, but also a bit disappointing. Essentially, all last-gen consoles will not be getting any more major updates, which is a bit of a bummer and makes me question if the DLC will be available to us last-gen scrubs at all. I mean, it makes sense that the DLC would be taking advantage of these new features, but it is a bit of a letdown for those who haven't upgraded yet and have been looking forward to this game since it was originally announced. But I don't see a gaming community segregated by their platform of choice, and as such, I'm happy that CDPR is doing their best to keep adding content. All in all, my experience with this game was top-notch, even with some of the crashes and odd bugs. After all, it's part of that Cyberpunk charm, right? So if you haven't given it a shot yet, I recommend it. It was certainly worth the 70+ hours I put into it. And listen, guys, there was no way I could cover everything, and I certainly didn't get to everything in the game for sure. There were still some Cyber Psycho missions that I missed out on, and some other side gigs that I plan to go back and revisit after beating the game. And I don't want this to be seen as like some crazy review, I guess. I just kind of wanted to detail my experience and talk about what kind of bothered me and, what I really enjoyed about the game. So if you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments down below and subscribe for more content. This has been AlPal. Be kind, be safe, and spread the love. Until next time, peace.